So my argument here would be that what we do to animals is bad, and we should work to reduce the harm that we produce with regards to that. But I don't believe it makes one immoral to not do so.
Repeat after me. It is impossible to shop ethically in a capitalist society. Every time you buy something, you usually pay taxes on it. Those taxes can go to unethical things. You are being pretentious when you tell someone how to shop.
Expecting everyone to be vegan is ableist, classist, and leans pretty hard into the colonialist mindset.
I really do feel the way that you see your diet is from a very racist and classist point of view that you will never understand because you probably can't comprehend it. But maybe if you get something from this, cool, but I really don't think you will. But if you do, let me know.
Veganism is a byproduct of colonization.
Hey, what is up, guys? So today we're going to be covering very common anti-vegan leftist arguments. I was initially going to make my own video covering this, and upon my research process, I found Intraspecies and her video on this, and to be honest, she covered basically everything I was going to cover, and more, like things that I genuinely did not even think about. She has a particular talent when it comes to responding to anti-vegan leftist arguments, so for that reason, and also the fact that I'm extremely sick and my voice sounds like shit right now, I'm going to be just reposting her entire video. It was an amazing video, and I think the video itself and her channel deserves much more traction. So definitely go subscribe to her. And anti-vegans watching, yes, I'm definitely sick because I'm not ingesting on a daily basis the rotting flesh of the innocent, the excretions of a bovine mammal, and something that comes out of a chicken's asshole. Oh, and one more thing, this video is not meant to shit on leftists. It's more so to address leftist anti-vegan arguments. I'm not somebody who is anti-left, and I'm also not somebody who is on the right of the political spectrum. When it comes to politics, I like to do this really crazy thing where I look at things issue by issue and see where I agree, as opposed to, give into this sort of false dichotomy of left and right. Very crazy, I know. All right, let's get into the video. Enjoy, and thank you again, Intraspecies, for allowing me to use it.
No ethical consumption under capitalism. If you say this, then you are committed to either one of two ideas. Either A, all consumption is equally unethical, or B, the ethicality of different forms of consumption exists on the spectrum. If you agree with the first premise, and that all consumption is equally unethical, then the conclusion of that is that anything you purchase or consume under capitalism is equally unethical. There is no point in purchasing any sort of eco-friendly products, any sort of products typically viewed as more ethical, supporting local businesses, or anything like that. If all consumption is equally unethical, then it's important to note that you also can't really tell people to do things like boycott Chick-fil-A, or stop buying things made of or packaged in plastic, or otherwise promote any sort of more ethical form of consumption. This position also has some, what I would consider to be worrying conclusions. If you're familiar with Bosch, he's pretty infamous amongst vegans for maintaining this position, and consequently having to concede to things like the idea of purchasing something as horrible and terrible and disgusting as child porn being equally as unethical as thrifting a t-shirt. Personally, I don't find this position to be very convincing, and it doesn't seem like a very comfortable hill to die on for me. I would also argue that when we're speaking about this in the context of veganism specifically, animal agriculture is the single most unethical industry to exist, and that this lends credibility to the idea that ethicality of consumption exists on the spectrum. The reason I cite animal agriculture as being the most unethical industry to exist has to do with three main reasons. 1. The scale upon which it occurs is unlike anything we have ever seen. We kill upwards of 1 trillion animals every single year. About 70 billion of those are land animals who have almost all lived their lives within the violent confines of factory farms and faced brutal deaths. The amount of victims killed is so large that our brains can hardly comprehend it. No industry even comes close to these numbers, let alone the suffering it also entails, especially because the suffering is also magnified to this degree. 2. There's no amount of reformation that can prevent the problems inherent to animal farming. As long as it exists, regardless of what form it takes or what economic system it operates under, animals will necessarily have to be exploited for profit and killed. This is not necessarily true of other industries, where the issues they present are not intrinsic to the practices upon which they operate. This means that abolition for animal agriculture is the only answer. Not welfare reformation, not scaling down the intensity, but actually doing away entirely with these industries. 3. We can be sure of the efficacy of boycotting animal agriculture and that it will be conducive to our goal of addressing what the victims go through. And this certainty is not guaranteed when we look at other industries, where it's possible, though depending on the industry, not necessarily categorically true, that boycotting is neither the best nor most practical solution, and that rigorous welfare reformation would be the way to approach them, something which our consumption habits do not dictate. This is especially true because, depending on which products we are suggesting people boycott, we could be setting an impossible standard for people to follow. I will discuss this more in the 7th section that covers the agave and avocados argument. If you agree with the second premise, and that the ethicality of different forms of consumption exists on the spectrum, then the relevant point is not there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, but rather, is the purchase of animal products sufficiently unethical so as to avoid purchasing them? At that point, the discussion would be about what traits characterize an unethical purchase and/or discussing whether consuming animal products is ethical, unethical, or amoral. How the conversation proceeds from here is entirely dependent on your interlocutor's response as to why they might not find animal products sufficiently unethical so as to avoid them. As a general rule of thumb, pressing them on name the trait can be a great way of responding to what they say. If you're unfamiliar with what name the trait is, it's a consistency test developed by Isaac Brown or Ask Yourself that goes as follows. What is true of animals that, if true of humans, would make it okay to kill and eat humans? It's basically asking for the morally relevant distinction between humans and non-human animals that justifies this treatment for one and not the other. 100 companies are responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas emissions. A related argument that people often present to substantiate the idea that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism is a citation of an article that they claim proves only 100 companies are responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I would like to make a separate video going through the study that the article cites in depth, but to give you a relatively summarized response to it, the researchers did not conclude that 100 companies are actually emitting those gases, but rather that they are providing the fuel to consumers who then burn it and emit the gases themselves. In a correspondence between Full Fact and CDP, who conducted the study, CDP said, quote, "The total estimated cumulative greenhouse gas emissions released by human activity, excluding carbon dioxide from land use change in forestry, and agricultural methane, between 1988 and 2015, 71% of those emissions originated from 100 fossil fuel producers. This includes the emissions from producing fossil fuels like oil, coal, and gas, and the subsequent use of the fossil fuels they sell to other companies." To help demonstrate this point with an example, Shell and ExxonMobil are two of the companies the study cites. If anyone has ever filled their car up at one of those stations and driven it, then they have become part of the 71%. The study was simply saying that those two companies were their source of that energy or emissions, something which the first line of the article that people often cite even admits. Blame corporations and not individuals. This argument is similar to the prior two arguments. Leftists will often accuse vegans of blaming individuals when we should be holding corporations accountable for their actions. I would argue that boycotting animal agriculture on an individual level is holding them accountable. They exist to meet the demand of consumers. The more people demand their products, the more they will produce them, and the more we will see animals tortured and slaughtered. These corporations don't care about your empty promises of guillotining them, because at the end of the day, you're still giving them your money. They're not going to change on their own without an incentive to do so. Restricting their profit is that incentive. They exist to meet our demands. We are the ones keeping them in business, so we cannot pretend like we play no role or bear no responsibility in what they do. And when we're talking about this independent of the context of veganism, it can be difficult to understand to what extent we should strive to live more ethically. I think one important question to ask ourselves when contemplating whether we should give up a product would be, am I confident that the alternatives to this product do not result in a similar or comparable amount of rights violations? In many cases, such as in the case of coconuts, there's no way to prove that literally all of the other crops available to us do not come from conditions that are comparably terrible and result in a greater amount of rights violations. In the case of animal agriculture, however, it is provable. Eating meat is justified when it is cultural. For anyone familiar with logical fallacies, this is easily identified as an appeal to culture fallacy, which occurs when someone says that an action is justified by virtue of it being cultural. When you set this standard, you are committed to the idea that anything, so long as it is cultural, is justified. Of course, this can justify just about anything, including female genital mutilation. The typical response to that is something along the lines of, well, eating meat and female genital mutilation are different, so that's why one is okay and one is not. This is just logically inconsistent and logically contradictory. You cannot both say that culture is a sufficient justification and that it is not a sufficient justification. To further explain this, once you have justified eating meat because it's cultural, you have just identified culture as a sufficient justification in and of itself. Again, to reiterate, this commits you to the idea that anything is justified because it's cultural. When you reject this in the case of FGM, you are admitting that culture alone is not a reliable way to determine the morality of something, and therefore cannot be why eating meat is justified. When looking at why one would be okay with eating meat but not FGM, the fact that it is cultural is irrelevant, because this trait is shared between the two, and thus is not a differentiating factor between them. What actually matters is what the real differences between those two practices are, because the actual differences are what is going to be useful in determining why you accept one and not the other. Further, when the idea of culture is brought up, it is often used to convey the idea that vegans hate indigenous people, or that veganism is anti-indigenous. I'm not going to deny that there are vegans who do make hateful generalizations about indigenous communities, and also that we should work to call them out when it happens, which, in my experience, we do. However, it is worth noting that using indigenous people as pawns in your argument against veganism is insulting. Indigenous vegans have expressed their frustration towards non-indigenous people who do this, especially because animal agriculture contributes towards the oppression of indigenous tribes in South America by displacing them from their land and murdering them when they don't comply. Essentially, you have a case of non-indigenous people using the oppression of indigenous people to justify the non-vegans' decision to fund a different form of oppression, one which is also responsible for further oppressing indigenous tribes. Crop pickers. Blaming vegans for the conditions of crop pickers, or acting like we're not aware of it, seems to be a pattern that is repeated every few months, and every time it happens, it's exhausting to deal with. We were never under the impression that the industries we contribute to aren't also cruel in many ways. This is pretty much unavoidable given our current system of production. So when people act as though we do think this, it really amounts to nothing more than a straw man argument that they are attacking for the purpose of either discrediting vegans and or seeking confirmation bias and reassurance from their fellow non-vegans. It's also very odd how we are the ones being targeted in these posts when everyone in the world eats these crops. Why are vegans alone, who count for about 3% of the world's population, held responsible and targeted for the industries that 100% of the world's population contributes to? They will say that it's a reminder of where our food comes from, because we think we don't contribute to harmful industries. But again, this is just an overused and tired strawman argument, one that I would argue is simply a smokescreen for them wanting to discredit us in an effort to feel better about their own actions. Further, if this concern for worker welfare was anything other than a transparent attempt to punish vegans for something we are not responsible for, and or to worsen the public's image of us, then we would both see these discussions take place independent of the context of veganism, and also see slaughterhouse workers included in these discussions. But they never are. I have had people who accused me of not caring about human rights, and then just blatantly tell me they didn't care when I responded outlining the human rights violations that animal agriculture is responsible for. I also find it ironic how they always seem to either imply or explicitly state that we should minimize our contributions to these industries, while also advocating against a movement and lifestyle that would minimize the need for these industries. Global veganism would require far fewer crops to be grown because we would have 70 billion fewer mouths to feed. The non-vegans who present this argument often seem to forget that cows don't photosynthesize. Veganism is racist, ableist, and classist. I'm grouping these three things together because the response to them is pretty much the same. It's worth noting that there is nothing inherent about veganism that entails racism, ableism, or classism. Veganism itself is simply a movement seeking to secure rights for an oppressed group of individuals. The accusations of prejudice typically stem from the fact that there exist obstacles in terms of accessibility to some people, or that there are individuals within the vegan movement that exhibit these characteristics, which are practical issues, not philosophical ones. But many people will nonetheless observe this and then extrapolate that veganism as a movement and sometimes as an ideology generally or overwhelmingly takes the form of these prejudices. When this is the case, it is, ironically, very dismissive of the people that this position claims to be standing up for. Non-white, disabled, and poor vegans exist, and to paint veganism as something only for privileged, white, and able-bodied individuals erases their voices and experiences, something that they have expressed frustration over many times. These frustrations, however, tend to fall on deaf ears when they are targeted towards non-vegans, because acknowledging the existence of these vegans and listening to them when they tell you that being privileged is not a prerequisite to being vegan does not suit the narrative that veganism is either completely or mostly reserved for white, wealthy, able-bodied people. Vegans still eat agave, avocados, soy, quinoa, etc. The response to this argument is related to what I talked about in the no ethical consumption under capitalism and the crop picker section, and that it is impossible to expect people to only consume things that were produced ethically. If you're going to argue against the consumption of a certain crop, then you have to prove that the production of that crop is sufficiently more unethical than the other crops we eat so as to prompt us to avoid purchasing it. It doesn't make sense to say something like, you shouldn't eat avocados because the conditions in which they're grown are bad, if the same or comparable conditions can be found in pretty much every other food we consume, or if you can't prove that they're sufficiently more unethical than those other foods. That burden of proof would be on you, and you would need comparative data that examines the production system holistically to even be able to confidently make that case. There needs to be a symmetry breaker, such as the symmetry breakers I provided between animal agriculture and all other industries in the first part of this video. Also, I want to specifically address soy and agave. If a non-vegan has an issue with the production of soy, then veganism seems to follow on their view, considering the majority of the world's soy is grown to feed the animals whom we slaughter. And in terms of agave, the argument tends to be that vegans are hurting fruit bats because agave production is destroying their habitat. First, it is not vegans that are largely driving the demand for agave, it is the production of tequila. That is what most agave is farmed for. It is actually what is discussed by the NPR article that seems to be what prompted this entire argument in the first place. Further, the only evidence I have ever seen presented for this was an article in which agave farming was presented as simply one possible theory regarding the decline of fruit bat populations. It was not conclusive. Even more interesting, in my opinion, is that an alternative theory is cattle ranching. Vegans don't care about human rights. The problem with this argument is that compassion is not a zero-sum game, and we are capable of caring about more than one thing at a time. There exist several different issues all around the world and movements to address each of them. No one goes up to someone who blogs about feminism and tells them that they don't care about Black lives because they're not dedicating their time towards Black Lives Matter instead of feminism. Because there tends to be an implicit understanding that both issues matter, that both deserve their own dedicated movement, and that dedicating your time to one does not mean you don't care about the other. Also, vegans actually do tend to care very deeply about human rights and actively argue and advocate in favor of them. Vegans are the only people I have ever seen care about and raise awareness for the human rights violations animal agriculture is responsible for, such as the traumatizing conditions slaughterhouse workers face, and the environmental racism factory farms are guilty of, and the displacement and murder of indigenous people. Yes, we are passionate about veganism, and we may dedicate a lot of our time towards it, but that does not mean we are not also capable of being passionate about human rights, or that we can't also dedicate time towards those issues as well. What animals are enduring is unequivocally horrible, and they need someone to fight for them. I would fight for you too if you were being killed in a gas chamber or ground up alive in a giant blender. To anyone who may still be reluctant to accept my criticism of this argument, all I ask is that you watch the video called From Farm to Fridge, linked in the description, in its entirety, and then tell me that this issue is not important enough to have a dedicated movement. To help elevate the voices of the people who are often erased by many of these arguments, I am including vegans you can follow that help break the white, privileged, able-bodied, wealthy vegan stereotype. All of their accounts will be linked in the description. Listening to what they have to say and making their voices heard and known is an essential part in combating these sorts of things. While I was asking around for who would like to be included, I was also directed towards this discussion about how dismissing veganism as a privileged movement ultimately harms non-privileged people by discouraging advancements and making it more accessible. In this article, detailing what it's like to live as a vegan with a disability, including experiences with ableism, and ways to make veganism more manageable with a disability. Further, I was recommended this website called Vegan Voices of Color, whose mission is to spread awareness on the connections of oppression that connect animal agriculture and people of color. From there, I also found Black Vegans Rock, which, according to their website, was founded with the purpose to research and compile a list of influential Black vegans who are doing incredible work to dismantle the stereotype that veganism was a white person's thing, and to create a platform devoted to spotlighting incredible Black vegans every day. I will link all of these in the description as well so that you can read them, which I strongly encourage. Additionally, I would like to play a clip of Angela Davis discussing why she's vegan and how it's an important part of challenging the harmful system of production upon which we operate.
And I am sometimes really disappointed that many of us can assume that we are these radical activists, but we don't know how to reflect on the food that we put in our own bodies. We don't realize the extent to which we are implicated in the whole process of capitalism by participating uncritically in the food politics offered us by the great corporations. And I usually don't mention that I'm vegan, but that has evolved, I think, and I think it's the right moment to talk about it because it is, I think, a part of a revolutionary perspective. How can we not only discover more compassionate relations with human beings, but how can we develop compassionate relations with the other creatures with whom we share this planet?
To close, I would like to thank anyone who stuck around this long for actually doing so. I only want to present the strongest arguments, so if there's something wrong with anything I've said, I'm definitely willing to listen, learn, and grow. This topic tends to make people tense because of how passionately each side wants to defend their points. However, I truly cannot help but feel that almost all of the pushback vegans face is rooted in the projection of guilt and the state of psychological distress caused by cognitive dissonance. I feel as though these arguments have less to do with people genuinely believing in them and having thought critically about their position, and more to do with the fact that they are seeking comfort in confirmation bias and the reassurance that what they are doing is okay, because the alternative seems so inconvenient and so uncomfortable. So, to any non-vegan watching this, I would really encourage you to think introspectively and consider how much of your position is informed by what you believe to be strong arguments, and how much of it is informed by your own personal desire to consume animal products and the consequent inclination you may have to blindly defend that. As always, thank you all for watching and supporting what I do.
Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who's your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude, even vegans don't get your weird,